Hi, HR Nation, it's Chris Rainey. Welcome to HR Leaders, the show where we interview today's most successful and innovative HR practitioners 5 days a week. Today, we have a very special guest. We're joined by Whitney Johnson. Whitney is a CEO advisor and one of the world's leading management thinkers, part of the Thinkers 50. She's also the author of the forthcoming book, The A-Team. Whitney, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Chris. Delighted to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Whitney, tell our listeners, fill in the gaps, tell them a little bit about yourself and your journey to where we are today.
My journey, well, there's so many different starting points, but I'll start with the starting point of about a decade ago. I had been a top-ranked analyst, equity analyst at Merrill Lynch after it had been about 8 years. And at this point in time, I needed a new challenge. I had learned what I could. It was time for me to do something new. I wanted to move on to a management track. And so I went to a senior executive, shared this dream with him, hoping to win his sponsorship and have him say, okay, that's right. You're talented. You worked hard. You're award winning. I'm going to give you my support. But instead, he was dismissive. He was discouraging. And I left within a year. I think this kind of scenario actually plays out in companies every day. It's costing you dollars. It's costing you pounds. It's costing you euros. It's costing you time. And no one means to be this kind of manager. In fact, your plan is to be this great boss and you want to bring your dreams to work and make sure the people who work for you bring their dreams to work. But of course, it's a classic innovator's dilemma because when you've got fires to put out, you need all hands on deck. You can't possibly let your people do something new. You need them to do a great job right where they are until they aren't. And so, as I said, I left within the year. Since that time, I went on to co-found an investment firm with Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School. You might remember him. He wrote the book, The Innovator's Dilemma.
Yeah, we definitely remembered him.
And while we were investing, I had this insight that this framework that we were applying to products also applied to people. And just as a disruptive low-end product like a Pac-Man can eat away at the market share of an incumbent, like Netflix did to Blockbuster, personal disruption is about the movement from the bottom of a learning curve to the top, like when I started as a stock analyst, and then jumping to the bottom of the next learning curve to learn, to leap and repeat. And what I discovered is that this drives engagement, engaged people innovate, companies with engaged people get ahead of the competition, they don't get disrupted, they disrupt.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. So where we are now then, what would you say is your area of expertise?
Well, my area of expertise is trying to get leaders to pay attention to what they're not paying attention to. And so I'll have lots of CEOs worrying and wondering as I go about my coaching, and which is, coaching and even keynoting with industry conferences. And they'll say, well, how do I protect myself against the competition? How do I remain relevant? How do I lower my we're about to get disrupted score? And how can I know? And what I found in my research is that you simply need to take the pulse of your workforce. I'm going to say that again. If you want to know if you're about to get disrupted, just take the pulse of your workforce. Everyone in your organization, including you, is on a learning curve, one that begins with inexperience, then you move into engagement. So on that back of that S of the learning curve, and then you move into mastery. And you optimize your team with 15% of your people at the low end, 15% of your people at the high end, and 70% of your people in the sweet spot. And so what I've done over the last couple of years is really codified this framework. I talk about it in my book, Build an A-Team, on how to use this framework to recruit and hire, to manage people at the low end of the curve when they're inexperienced. What are the benefits of their inexperience? How to manage people in the sweet spot and the high end. And when they get to the top of that curve, the cycle starts over. And the bonus in all of this is that when you are willing to facilitate personal disruptions for your people, you become a boss that people love, a boss that people want to work for.
Mm-hmm. So what's some of the things that HR leaders aren't doing around innovation that they probably should, or they should be paying more attention to? So what are some of the things around innovation that HR leaders aren't paying attention to that they probably should?
Yeah. So As I just alluded to, I think that the thing that they're not paying attention to is that if you can analyze, so I've developed this diagnostic that allows you to figure out where people are on the S curve or the learning curve. And so what they're not paying attention to is that they're thinking, okay, I've got to figure out how to make sure that I am helping the CEO, helping all of our C-suite manage the business. And what I would say HR leaders in particular aren't paying attention to and aren't aware of is that if they will use the data, understanding where people are on their learning curves, are they at the low, the high, and the middle? Do they have too many people at the high end of the curve? They now have this incredible strategic insight to go to the CEO with and say, hey, we've just done this diagnostic. We know that we've got 30% of our workforce at the high end of the learning curve. We have got to do something about this, because now they're at the high end, they're either going to leave, or even worse, they're going to start to get complacent, disengaged, and bored. And when you're disengaged, you're not innovating, you get disrupted. So now you've got the HR officers understanding that it's not just relegated to managing people. You now have information that becomes a strategic imperative for your CEO. Take the pulse of our workforce. We'll know if we're about to get disrupted. If we'll move our workforce around, then we lower our we're about to get disrupted score. That is valuable information. And you then become this strategic player within the C-suite.
Mm. It's funny you say that, because I looking back on my own experience, that's exactly what happened with me leaving my business. I was looking for other avenues that I wanted to work within, and my role, I felt like, I literally had been doing it for 10 years. And for me, my brain wanted more. 10 years doing the same thing over and over again. As much as I love my team, I love the business, I loved everything we did. And the business didn't give me that flexibility. They just didn't even acknowledge actually that was
Right.
even it's
Exactly.
like, that's what you do. So where do we start? What would be some of the first steps that we can take then to move in the right direction?
Yeah, so I would say the starting place is for you to just be aware that you're on a learning curve. And I think for everybody who's listening to this, just like you reflected, you're like, oh, exactly, I am on a learning curve. And one of the places to start is to say, okay, well, where am I on the curve currently? And so, for example, if you've been in a role for 6 months to a year, you're likely at the low end of the learning curve. And so what that helps you understand is that at this low end, you're going to be inexperienced. And because you're inexperienced, there are going to be lots of days where you're going to feel discouraged and feel like you don't quite know what you're doing. The good news there is that when you're inexperienced, you ask a lot of questions. You wonder, why are we doing this the way that we're doing it? And so there are a lot of opportunities for innovation that come from having people who are at the low end of the learning curve, but also recognizing that they're inexperienced, they're going to get discouraged, and you sometimes might get a little impatient. And so that's at the low end of the learning curve of what you can understand in terms of where do you start. With your people on the sweet spot of the learning curve, that's where all of their neurons are firing and they're feeling incredibly competent. They're now basically in that role for 2 to 3 years, and they're feeling very confident. What you want to do with your people in the sweet spot is make sure that you're continuing to give them lots of stretch assignments. Assign what I call Goldilocks assignments, where things are hard, but not too hard, because that's where you get the most out of people.
You want to keep them stimulated, right?
Yes, you want to keep them stimulated. In fact, there's a wonderful story I'll tell you very quickly about a woman named Alana Golan. So she was in the Israeli military and had been a fighter pilot. She had trained a lot of fighter pilots. She goes to Intel in Israel as an intern. So on the one hand, she's at the height of the curve, right? She's been a fighter pilot, but on the other hand, she's at the low end of the curve as an engineer. And so her boss really took advantage of her being in many ways in this sweet spot and gave her this really tough assignment of trying to figure out, okay, what problems are going to need to be solved that aren't being solved? Well, one of the things she discovered is the software that you use to verify whether or not your software is working. Those tools were going to get out of date very, very quickly. So he gave her the stretch assignment of like, you've got to figure out how to solve this. He allows her to go to Sweden to meet with this company that they think might have a solution. They're focused on railway infrastructure. Turns out they do have a solution. She tests this, and they eventually were able to come up with a solution. They had to decide if they were going to build or buy. They eventually decided to buy that. Well, that's a great stretch assignment. What if he just put her behind a desk and said, do this silly little thing? And she's like, what? I've just been a pilot in the Israeli Air Force. And so I think that one of the best things that we can do for our people in the sweet spot and all along the curve is to put them in really demanding situations, because when you're in a demanding situation, you learn. And when you're learning, your brain is getting all this dopamine. And so you are super happy.
Yeah.
And then the top of the curve, I'll just explain that quickly. That's typically when you've been in the role 3 to 4 years, maybe 5 years. You're a master. You know exactly what you're doing. But as you know, that's a real danger zone. You can keep people there for 6 months, maybe a year, where you can say, okay, we've invested in you. We need you to transmit what you've learned. We need you to mentor. We need you to facilitate collaboration. But at the same time, I will commit to you. I will come to your aid. I'm going to applaud what you've done. I'm going to help you identify a new role, and then I'm going to deliver in helping you jump to a new role. That allows the person to stay engaged while they're bringing other people along the curve, but then they'll also be able to jump to a new curve. And guess what? Then they go back to being inexperienced again, asking lots of questions, figuring out how to sink or swim. And so the cycle starts all over again. And when you are constantly putting people in the sweet spot of that S curve, you have people engaged people don't leave, and they innovate.
It's so funny you just said that, because my last podcast this morning was with the vice president of HR for General Mills, and she'd been there for, I think, over 10 years, if not more, I think 15 years actually in the organization. And I said to her, how did you stay there that long? And it's exactly what you said. Every time she got to that peak, they moved her over to manufacturing, and over to supply chain, and it was moving all over. And then when that got to not say boring, but it wasn't engaged, then they moved to a different country. So I want an international assignment now, and then they moved from the US. Now she's based in Switzerland, and again, it's this whole new world. And it's just, without doing that, you lose. The most successful HR leaders I speak with that have been in companies for long, they've just moved all over the business.
That's
and
right.
And the companies have been willing to do that. They understand that in order for us to keep this talent, and sometimes they even take a step back. I found steps back into completely different roles you'd never expect to go a step forward again.
That's right. Absolutely. Exactly. And in fact, what's fun about that is when you take a look at this 7-point framework of personal disruption that I created, which is in my prior book, Disrupt Yourself, step number 5, or lever number 5 that you can pull in order to harness change, is a willingness to step back in order to grow, because that step back can turn into a slingshot. Really, really powerful. I love that you shared that story of the HR exec at General Mills.
Do you know what's funny as well? The story you shared earlier about the Israeli pilot, I think you mentioned. Yeah. My best manager below me was an ex-Israeli medic in the army. And when he joined our team,
similar situation.
Exactly. Yeah. Is literally, when you said that story, I was so smiling, because I was like, he came into the team, and it was sales. So traditionally in London, it was a very fast-paced environment, and it was seen as stressful. He came in and he almost laughed at the fact that people were stressed in that environment. He's like, I've just came from the army as a medic. I'm healing people on the in a war. And then you give me a phone, and you say, oh, it's a bit scary to pick up the phone and speak to HR directors. He's like, this is not stressful in any way, shape or form. And he actually became, he sort of had the record of, the most sales in the business globally, and actually left and now runs his own successful organization. And it was seeing him in that environment and everyone else around him. It was like, I could just completely relate to your story on that one. Yeah, very, very interesting. So where are the sort of the hidden opportunities for HR to help impact innovation then? Because I think this is something that HR leaders don't really relate themselves to, in terms of the impact that they can have in terms of innovation in the organization. What are the areas that you feel HR can have the most impact in?
Well, that's what's so exciting is that this framework takes HR from being on the sidelines to having vital strategic information. I'll give you an example of something that just happened within the last week. So I went into an organization that has been in an industry with a lot of disruption. And one of the things that we were able to do is by administering what I call the S-curve locator, the SCL, and figuring out where everybody was on the S curve, one of the things that we discovered is a lot of people had just moved to brand new roles. So you were like, this is fantastic. You've got a lot of people at the low end of the learning curve, a lot of people who don't know what they're doing. So they're asking questions and they're figuring things out. Well, when we administered this S curve locator, a lot of people were showing up in the sweet spot of the learning curve. And we're like, what? That makes no sense.
Yeah.
And so as we peeled it back and we looked at a lot of the different questions, the individual questions that people were asking and answering, we saw a lot of neutrals. And neutral sometimes means not this, not that, but more frequently it means I'm really afraid right now and I'm not going to say what I'm really thinking, so I'm just going to write neutral. And so what we discovered when we looked at this diagnostic is that there were, a lot of people, there weren't 0% of the people saying, I'm feeling scared right now. I don't know how to do my job. There were in fact 40 and 50% of the people who were saying that. And so we discovered that there were a lot of closet low end of the curve people. And if they were willing to own the fact that in fact they were in the low end, not in the sweet spot, you had this whole core of people who were really ready to question, to innovate, et cetera. And so the way that HR can use this data is they can analyze the workforce, figure out where they are on the learning curve, peel back, look at it, analyze it, and then talk to the C-suite and say, okay, folks, we've got a problem here because we've got a lot of people who are at the top of that. They're fantastic people, but if we leave them, they're going to start to get complacent and they're no longer going to come up with good ideas. So we've got to take some of these high performers at the top of the curve, have them jump to a new curve so that we can get them to re-engage and get the absolute best out of their brain, and so that they will continue to stay high performers, and so that we as a company can continue to remain relevant.
Mm-hmm. So when you say communicate with the employees, have you got any examples of companies that are doing this successful in terms of being able to tap into the knowledge of their employees and grab those ideas?
Yeah, in fact, let me tell you a quick story because this is a fun example of what this can look like. So I want you to imagine for just a minute, I'm going to bury the lead a little bit because it makes it more fun. So I want you to imagine that you get this call from a headhunter, and it's for a company that sells a product that was invented 60 years ago. And at the time, it was obviously an important invention. It kept expensive rockets and missiles from rusting, but it hasn't changed much since then. So you're like, would you be interested? Would you even entertain the opportunity? Probably not, until you learn that people love to work at this company. Engagement scores are at 90% plus. Now maybe you're going to be a bit more interested. You're also probably thinking, well, how do they do this? Well, that's what I wanted to know when I interviewed the CEO of the company, Gary Rich. Now you might be Googling right now because you're trying to figure out what company I'm talking about.
I'll do that after.
This was a perfect company to test my hypothesis that if you will let your people learn to go where they haven't gone before, to quote James T. Kirk from Star Trek, they will stay at your company. So here's a company, 3 of their senior people started as receptionists. One of them is now the brand manager. When we administered our diagnostic, we found that 60% of the people in the company said, I can satisfy my career goals here without ever leaving. So this is a company, they develop their people through repeated personal disruptions. They learn, they leap, they repeat. Over the past 20 years, the market cap has grown from $250 million to $1.6 billion. Not bad for a company, and now I'm going to tell you the company that makes a can of oil. It's WD-40.
WD-40, yeah. Wow.
Isn't that amazing?
It's amazing.
It's
No,
amazing,
it's
right?
just the reason I asked you that question as well is that so many organizations don't give their employees flexibility, and it's just seems crazy to me. The more I think about it now, it's almost like it's a lack of trust. Like if you can't entrust you, if you need to actually manage your employees and you don't trust them to be able to do the job, then they shouldn't probably be there in the first place. You don't need to babysit. People are grown-ups. They can do that. And don't get me wrong, there are times where it's definitely needed, but it's a very interesting story. I'd love, we could talk about it for ages. I'd love to have an understand of what their processes look like internally and how they measure what its success looks like in an organization like that. That must be very interesting.
It is. It's fascinating. I actually interviewed him for my podcast. So for people who want to
let us know about
listen
that.
to that more, you can go to the Disrupt Yourself podcast and put the link in the show notes and listen to him.
Definitely.
I mean, it's, and what's fascinating is that the CEO himself has been there for 18 years. So here's a person who has found ways. You think, well, can you disrupt yourself when you're in the CEO role? Yeah, you can. You find ways to continue to learn. So there are different, sometimes it's a more obvious, you move someone from one country to the next, or you move from someone from manufacturing to sales. But you still can disrupt yourself even when you're the CEO. You just have to be willing to, on occasion, jump to the bottom of a learning curve, not know what you're doing, and figure it out.
I mean, that's just part of innovation in general, right?
Absolutely.
You have to be willing.
Absolutely.
You have to be willing to go back a step to go forward, and you have to be willing to fail many times.
Exactly.
But most businesses are sitting there trying to make a calculated decision to make sure we 100% get it right on the first time around. And that's just not reality. It doesn't work. Even if I look back at the first 10 episodes of my podcast, I'm like, oh my God. But I just took the risk to just do it.
Right.
I'm sure you know the feeling.
Exactly.
Perfect.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so fascinating when I listen to like my very first podcast episode and the interviews that I did and the quality of the interviews now. I mean, it's a learning curve, right? It's as with anything, and you just get better over time. And I occasionally disrupt myself so that it will stay fresh, as I'm sure you're doing the same thing.
Yeah, I love it. If anything, I love the journey more than the destination every time. It's almost like when I succeed something, I'm like, oh, what's next? What's next? We did the podcast and I was like, maybe we should go live now. That was like, my next, we've done 50 podcasts. Now I'm like, when's the 100 podcast going to come? So I think that's part of, you see that trait in many people who are constantly disrupting themselves. And my business partner and I were the same growing up. We were always, conquering one sport where it's running a marathon. And then the next week after, we would start playing ice hockey. And the week after that, we'd want to be professional skateboarders. And when we came to our business careers, we've kind of gone from friends to little kids into our business careers together. Somehow we managed to stay in the same field. And we've taken that same thing into our business, where we're always trying to disrupt ourselves and trying to completely change what the events industry looks like in the HR field to bring a whole new element and dimension to that. And that's what keeps us excited. Otherwise we would get bored. We'd come to work every day and be like, same thing yesterday, same thing as the day before. And going back to your point, we'll probably lose interest pretty quickly.
Absolutely.
Tell us more about your book that's coming up.
So I've actually been talking a lot about the book. I guess I'll share the genesis of it with you, because I think this is interesting. So as I mentioned earlier, I had co-founded an investment firm with Clay Christensen and had this big insight of like this personal disruption isn't just about products and services, that at a very high level, it's a framework for managing change that begins with the individual. And so I set out in writing the book, Disrupt Yourself, to help people figure out if it's time to make a change, and then to provide them with a framework of personal disruption that allows them, when it is time to make a change, to have a structure for doing that, whether they're trying to scale their organization or trying to deal with a massive reorg inside of their company, or just trying to get their people to be more innovative. And so one of the things that I discovered as I went around the world and spoke at events and coached and facilitated sessions was that people would say, you know what, I get it. I want to disrupt myself, but how do I get the ecosystem to let me do that? How do I get my boss to let me do that? And how do I get the people who work for me to disrupt themselves? And so that was the genesis of this book, Build an A Team, is how do you create an ecosystem, and how do you give a manager how do you give a leader a playbook for creating an environment where people can disrupt themselves? And again, in the process, as you let people disrupt themselves, you're allowing your organization, by disrupting itself, to be the disruptor as opposed to the disrupted. So disrupt yourself is for you, and build an A team is for your team.
It seems completely highly relevant to everything we've discussed, and exactly what I think our members are going to need to help them on their journey. So I'll definitely link that in the description. I personally also look forward to reading that. I'm quite excited. When's it out? When's it available?
It drops on May 1st. So pre-orders are available now. And I am, for anybody who is listening and has written a book or has thought about writing a book, you all will understand and know very well that writing the book is the easy part. Marketing is the hard and very fun and exciting, but it's a whole new learning curve in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, anything we can do to help you, happy to do that as well. Well, that leads us quite nicely onto the quickfire round, where I'm going to ask you 5 questions, and you have no longer than 30 seconds to give us some amazing answers. Are you ready?
Oh, I love that. That's a high bar. Amazing answers. Okay, yeah. I'll give you answers and they turn out to be amazing.
No problem. What was the number one thing that was holding you back from becoming a leader in your field?
Me. I think there was a lot of systemic aspect of it in terms of being a female. For example, women have to be 2.5 times more competent than men to be judged on equal footing. So there is a systemic component, but I think it's absolute myself. The way I think about the world and my paradigm is what holds me back more than anything else.
Fantastic. What's the best piece of business advice you've ever received?
Disrupt yourself.
Perfect. It's a great piece of business advice. What's one?
No, sorry. But that's it, right? I mean,
it's true. It was a
Christensen. I discovered this framework, and I'm like, the best possible thing you can ever do is to be willing to disrupt yourself. Yeah. Sorry, it was maybe a little too pithy, but there you go.
No, but it is completely straight to the point, which is exactly what the quickfire round's about. So it's great. What's one book you'd recommend to our audience, and why? Can be more than one, by the way.
Oh, I didn't hear you.
Sorry. I was saying, what's one book that you'd recommend to our audience, and why?
What's one book that I've read recently and I recommend, and why? Was that the question?
Yeah. What's one book that you'd recommend? Yeah.
Oh, just one? Okay.
You can say more than
all right.
one. You can say more than one.
Okay, I'm going to give you more than one. So one is a book called Willpower Doesn't Work. It's by Ben Hardy, that's coming out on March 1st. It's fantastic. And it really helped me okay, I'm not going to qualify. It helped me see that why I needed to build an A team, that we can want to change, but our ecosystem is really important. So then the question becomes is, how do we make sure we're choosing the ecosystem in which we're willing to play? Other 2 books I think are really powerful is When by Dan Peek. I just interviewed him for my podcast as well. The importance of everything is timing. It's not just timing is everything. And then the 3rd book is Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Workweek. I know it's an old book.
I've read it. It's one of the reasons.
Fantastic. Yeah. I just, because of reading that book, I've decided, and my daughter's open to it, we're going to do, after her senior year in high school, she's going to take a gap year and travel with me as I work. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun for both of us.
That's amazing. That is amazing. I've read that book, and it's one of the reasons that kind of gave me the confidence to do what I'm doing right now. That and a few others, but that was really something that really made an impact on me, that when I read, I was like, okay, wow. So it's
and you know what? I'm going to say one more book, because I just realized I said 3 men and no women. Okay. So much for gender parity. The 4th book I recently read, also interviewed her for my podcast. There's a pattern here, as you've noticed, is Powerful by Patty McCord. She was the Chief Human Resources Officer at Netflix. Super interesting. I think this audience, you all in particular, will really enjoy and appreciate her perspective of being on the ground floor of the development of that rocket ship that is Netflix.
Fantastic. Well, I'll definitely include all of those in the description for the readers. I'm sorry, I'm really excited. Could you share one internet resource that you use to keep up to date with current events and connect with your peers?
Twitter.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Twitter, LinkedIn. Yeah, Twitter and LinkedIn. Those are
normally the two I get anyway.
yeah, that's what keeps me up to date. A little bit Instagram, but really Twitter and LinkedIn.
Okay, fantastic. Well, look, you're giving us some amazing actionable advice. I really appreciate you taking the time out to join us. Give our listeners one parting piece of guidance. If there's one piece of guidance you can give to HR leaders out there, and also the best place for our listeners to find out a bit more about you, and if they want to reach out to you, what's the best place?
Okay. Parting piece of advice. I'm going to give you two. One is, if it's scary and if it's lonely, then you're on the right path to disruption. So self-evident, but I think, when you're a disruptor, you're playing where no one else is playing. So if you're ever feeling scared and lonely, then keep going. So that's one piece of advice. The next thing I would say, you asked me another question. I can't remember what it is. So
it was to understand a bit more, where can we get in contact with you? If we want to learn more about you, where can we find you? What's the best place for our listeners?
Oh yeah, go to my website, whitneyjohnson.com. Everything you want to find, you can find there.
Okay, fantastic.
I forgot to tell you the most important thing.
Okay.
I talked all about this diagnostic. If any of you want to try this diagnostic, for you or your team, then just go to whitneyjohnson.com/diagnostic, and then you can take it. And then you can also have, so there you go. You can figure out where you are on your current S-curve.
Can I take it as well? Is that all right?
Yeah, totally. You're going to be in the sweet spot. But yeah, you can totally.
No problem. Yeah, we're so young. We're probably going to be right there in your organization. Well, look, guys, head over to hrleaders.com. There you'll find all of the show notes on the episode. I'll link up everything we've discussed, all the resources, the books, everything that's been mentioned. And thank you again for taking the time to join us. I really appreciate it. And I wish you all the best until we next speak.
Thank you, Chris.